Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to some of you. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. This is the third in a series of webinars on planning for the 2017 point-in-time counts. Let me get my screen sharing here back up. There we go. Sorry, I don't know what happened. My name is Jordan Layton. I am a research analyst in the Homelessness Research Institute, which is part of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, leading national voice on the issue of homelessness in the U.S. Today's webinar, we're going to focus and feature the methodological approaches of two continuum of care from very different sides of the country. We have joining us Brian Roccapriore, who is the Director of HMIS and Strategic Analysis with the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. He'll present first. After Brian, we'll have a presentation from Claudia Powell, who is a social research scientist and Director of Evaluation with the University of Arizona Southwest Institute for Research on Women. And she has been involved with the TUCSON, PIMA County, Arizona counts. There'll be some opportunity to address some questions after Claudia's presentation. More on that in a minute. So for reference, HUD has many resources to help you in designing an accurate count. They recently posted some new resources to help you with counting youth. So please check those out. And they conducted a webinar last week on the 2017 count expectations. One of the most important steps in preparing for your point-in-time count is the methodology design so that it appropriately matches your geography, your volunteer capacity, your survey length, and so forth. It's certainly true that we're not going to be able to cover every aspect of an accurate pit count, especially considering the diversity of your COCs out there. But HUD's methodology guide is going to be a critical tool for helping you determine what's right for your community, and we feel it's quite beneficial for you to hear from communities who are implementing strong methodology approaches in the real world. So hopefully these featured communities today help you in those considerations as you plan your methodology, and also the examples and guidance shared in prior webinars as well. So lastly, before we get started, just to remind everyone, you can submit questions through the webinar software. There's a chat box labeled questions on the control panel. We'll have everybody's lines muted during the webinar, but please submit your questions through there. If it's a question intended for either Brian or Claudia specifically, please indicate that, and we'll hold all the questions to the end, and then at that point we'll answer as many of those as we can. And this webinar will be posted on the Alliance's website within about a week. So without further ado, let's turn the time over to Brian.
All right. Thank you, Jordan. You can hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. I have two screens here, and I never know which one of them ends up showing on the webinar, and I would hate for you to see my second screen that's all just black right now. So as you said earlier, I am Brian Roccapriore. I am the Director of HMIS and Strategic Analysis from the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, and that is a mouthful and usually takes up half my presentation time just to barrel through my name and job title. So one of the other hats that I happen to wear in the state is I am the PIT coordinator for the state of Connecticut. We've been coordinating the point-in-time count on a statewide level for the better part of a decade now. We have a ton of experience making mistakes and learning from all those bumps along the way. So hopefully today I'll help some of the folks out there not bang their head as hard as we have in the past. Before I really get going on the methodology side of things, I think it's necessary to provide like a little bit of context as to who we are and how we do things. So what's up on the screen right now is our COC structure for the state. In pretty short order, Connecticut went from having 13 COCs, and we're now down to 2. And throughout that whole merger process, TPCH has led the PIT count in a consistent method across all of our COCs, so we're able to compare our numbers over time in between our regions. The last thing that we really wanted to do was have 13 different COCs all off doing their own thing, which for those who are familiar with Connecticut, we are a state of 169 fiercely independent towns, and we're notorious for doing things different, even sometimes within the same town. So I know when a lot of people think of Connecticut, they think that we're just a bunch of millionaires who are living up on our yachts, or that we are just this little tiny postage-sized state up in the northeast corner of America. But I'm here to assure you that neither of those are true. And while we certainly aren't Texas-sized, my state is over 110 miles wide, and coordination of a PIT count on specifically our balance of state continuum of care, the green one on your screen right now, can be a real beast. So what we did is we geographically divided our state up into point-in-time count regions. And that is this more colorful map you're looking at right now. And we did that for coordination of our volunteer efforts for our unsheltered count. And now your first thought might be, is like, what the heck's going on here? This map makes even less sense than the last map you had on the screen. And that's because it doesn't make sense at first glance unless you know the geographic distribution of those who are experiencing homelessness in my state, and I don't expect anyone out there to know that. So an example being the little purple blip in the middle of the sea of green up here is the city of Hartford, which accounts for about 20% of our homeless population. So we have to assign the areas based on where our projects are and where we're most likely to need volunteers on the night of the point-in-time count. So we've divided our state up into regions, and with the coalition as the lead, each of those colorful regions gets a regional coordinator assigned who's responsible for all things PIT related in that region. Specifically to the sheltered side of things, they have to make sure that the housing inventory count's accurate, that the sheltered PIT count happens the way it's supposed to. Most of that stuff just flies out of HMIS, so it's not really that big of a deal. And they also get the fun logistics of making sure that the unsheltered count is handled. The regional coordinators work with all the projects in that region, make sure there's one point of contact per project so we don't have conflicting information flying around. And for our volunteers, each area is a little different. For some of our more dense urban regions, they need a small army to go out and canvass the areas, where some of our larger rural or more affluent regions don't really need so many. So we really do leave it up to the regions to decide how many volunteers they need for those nights. For recruitment of the volunteers, the largest source comes from projects in the various regions, which volunteer their staff, or as someone put it the other day, they were voluntold that they had to be part of their regional point-in-time count. And what we also do as the state coalition is recruit through a variety of social and print media, and all of our volunteers we're able to identify, we refer them to the region of which they want to volunteer for. The downside to that is we get a lot of people who are well-intentioned, who want to help, but are afraid to go into the regions where we actually need volunteers. So our regions are generally diverse enough where we can have our regional coordinators put people where they need to be, and we end up with the number that we need for the night of the count. Now, when we originally came up with our unsheltered methodology, we'd worked with a consultant and a demographer so we can come up with a way that we could properly extrapolate our unsheltered count numbers. And now I'm going to go into a little more depth in that in a little bit. But I did want to mention that our consultants and demographers, who we've changed over the years and worked with, they don't work for the warm fuzzy feeling in the heart that you get for doing good work. So we do actually have to pay them. It's just part of making sure that we get the most accurate count possible. And why do we go to an outside consultant and not just do it ourselves is because neither myself as the PIT lead or anyone in our COC has a PhD in demography. So while I could come up with something that sounded pretty good, it's best to have the professionals come in and lend credibility to what we're really doing. So on the bottom of this slide is a general timeline of what we do for our PIT activities. You can see we're now probably about 3 months deep into our 2017 count planning. We had a kickoff party early on, which is where we essentially bribe our regional coordinators with some donuts so we can get them to all be in one place and go over our general plan for the year, start identifying where we're going to do the unsheltered portion of our account. And our volunteer recruitment really gets into full swing in about 6 weeks or so. And we have all the volunteer trainings as close as the point in time count as we can actually get. Then point in time count in Connecticut this year is tentatively scheduled for the night of January 24th, which, as we all know, last 10 days of January. 2 years ago, we had to push it back because we had that eternal snowfall here in the Northeast, which I think it literally snowed for like 10 days solid. So we're praying for nice warm weather just like it happened in 2016. And then after that happens, we have 6 weeks of working with our regional coordinators and our consultants to make sure that everything is correct and valid leading up to the HDX submission, which my best guess is some point at the end of April. Now, how do we pick where we're going to survey? Because we can't cover our entire state with volunteers, because that's just a logistical impossibility. We do it based off of census block groups, and we have some areas that we call designated areas and some areas that we call sample areas. The designated areas are the high probability ones, and the sample areas are low probability ones. Both of the regions are where regional coordinators have to canvass on the night of the point in time count. That's not to say if someone is identified as experiencing homelessness in an area that is not either designated or sampled, that they can't be counted, but these are the areas that we absolutely have to canvass on the night of the count. The difference in those areas plays into the extrapolation that takes place after the count is done. So first are our designated areas, which are comprised of the block groups in which someone was identified in the previous unsheltered count, as well as additionally identified block groups by the regional coordinator as being a high probability area where we're going to find someone who is experiencing unsheltered homelessness. The additional areas that get added are a result of the local expertise of the PIT regions, and that comes about from working with the local outreach teams, working with local police, fire, parks department, anybody in the region who really has a stake in understanding and knowing where we might find somebody who is experiencing unsheltered homelessness on that night. And of course, working with all of our providers who have that word of mouth knowledge as to where people are staying when they're not in their projects. The sample of low probability block groups to be canvassed, they're generated as a random sample from within each of our COCs by some statistical software that we use. So while most of our work is done at a PIT region level, the sampling of the block groups comes at a COC level. So some of our regions are going to have more block groups to sample than others. And the extrapolation takes place afterwards, and it's the job of our consultant, and it involves formulas that look like they are they came directly out of the matrix and are well above my head. So if you want to know more about sampling weights and estimates and confidence intervals and how they're applied in relation to our high and low probability block groups, that is more than I was planning to get into today, although if you really want me to, I can. All of our point in time count reports going back to 2011 are available on our website, cch.org, for you to go and do what you will with. So last year was our first year that we ever used a mobile app to assist in our unsheltered count. And I got to tell you, it was probably the best thing that we've ever done as far as our unsheltered count goes. We worked with a group called SimTech Solutions as a contractor to provide us with the app and the tech assistance leading up to the count. The app itself uses the GPS coordinates on the phone or tablet that everyone's using, so we can pinpoint where the actual survey was conducted, which is great for a variety of reasons. As folks who have been working with your unsheltered point in time count, you've no doubt had a survey that came back that said something like behind the pizza place, when for those who aren't familiar with New Haven, it's the pizza capital of the world, and I will stand by that statement. And there are a lot of pizza places there, so then we have to go back to the regional coordinator to figure out who this volunteer was and where they were and which pizza place they're talking about. So we don't have to worry about any of that stuff anymore because it's all right there in pinpoint GPS world. And then what we can also do is see real time where these surveys are happening. So if we have a volunteer who's straying over the line into New York, we can just pick up a phone and call and be like, hey, get back. You're not in Danbury anymore. Come on back into Connecticut. And I think the best part is that we don't have to try to decipher the handwriting of a volunteer who's out at 11 p.m. when it's -2 degrees outside and they're freezing cold. And of course, there is also the great part about not having to do all that data entry after the fact. And we had some of our regions come and tell us that the mobile app, they can't do the mobile app in 2017 because we are mandating it as a state for everybody to use, and they can go ahead and they can still use their paper surveys all they want. But what we are requiring in 2017 is that within 24 hours after the unsheltered count happens, that they take those surveys back to their office and enter them into the app that way, because it's just logistically easier to make sure that all of that information comes in. It's nice and clean. It's in a great little CSV extract that we can get, and we can do whatever it is we need to do with that after it happens. So if you want to steal my stuff, go right ahead and do it. This is really kind of like a 10,000-foot overview of who we are and what we do. If there's specific questions, we pretty explicitly outline everything in our methodology and our PIT reports. Links up on the screen right now. I'm sure Jordan will be sending this around afterwards. Or if you are so inclined to go to Google and type in Connecticut PIT count, you'll get there. My email is also on the screen. I apologize for how long and confusing my last name is. I tried to get brian@tch.org, but they wouldn't let me. Feel free to reach out anytime with questions. Like most of you probably out there, it's 2016, so email is generally the best way to get me. I just want to thank NAH for having me out there today, and I will hang out for the Q&A session at the end if there are any questions. So Jordan, you can go ahead and steal that screen back.
Yeah, let's go ahead and go to Claudia now for her presentation.
Thanks, Jordan. I forgot to take myself off mute. Okay, let me get my screen showing. Okay, can you see my presentation and hear me okay?
Looks great.
Thank you. So like Jordan said, my name is Claudia Powell, and I am a researcher with the University of Arizona Southwest Institute for Research on Women. And I also am the PIT count leader and sit as a member of our TPCH, is the TUCSON PIMA Collaboration to End Homelessness, as our executive board. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of a presentation overview, give you a little bit of context about our county, and then talk about our mixed method approach we use to approach our point-in-time count, an overview of the count, and some of the intricacies about what we do with regard to connecting with the community, our PIT count trainings, the day of the count, and what happens after the count. And then, like Jordan and Brian said, we will have time for questions at the end. So here's Arizona, and I'm going to share a little bit of information with you about our PIT count, but I thought I needed to also, like Brian, share some information about our county or our geographic context. So we're located in Tucson, Arizona, which is right here. If that came up, let's see. Okay, right there. And one of the things, if you'll note, that we're about 45 minutes from the U.S.-Mexico border. So for many people experiencing homelessness in our community, documentation status is an additional barrier that they face. And our county is, the COC that I represent is this entire county, which looks small on this map, but it's actually about 140 miles across. And I also wanted to share a few pictures of our landscape. For those of you who have never been to Tucson or have been to Phoenix, we're about 90 miles away, but sort of worlds apart otherwise. And so if you'll notice the desert landscape, that's a lot of what we're facing and dealing with during the time of our point-in-time count. So what the TUCSON PIMA Collaboration to End Homelessness understood with the count is that we have to count in urban, rural, and desert areas, and we need a different strategy for each of these areas. We needed to engage multiple community partners. In the past, we've always been able to engage our COC partners, but needed to add more community partners because we needed more volunteers to adequately reach all of the different areas we needed to reach during our count. So in the past, we were able to engage between 100 and 200 volunteers, but we knew we needed more. So in this past year, we actually had about 350 volunteers who participated during our point-in-time count. And finally, we really wanted to generate some excitement around the point-in-time count. To be able to engage volunteers and motivate people to participate, we needed to bring passion, compassion, and enthusiasm to the count. We really wanted to be upfront in that we needed volunteers and how important it was to our community, but also then make sure to appreciate their efforts. So this is the county. So here's our whole continuum. This is PIMA County, and right in the middle is our metro area. So in this metro area, there's more than 1 million people who live here. These areas are what we refer to as our outlying communities. These are large suburban areas that have a lot of people, that probably wouldn't have a lot of people living in the streets, but have a good number of community members. So we know that there are people experiencing homelessness in these communities. And if you'll notice, the one on the far left-hand side, that's about 135 miles from Tucson. And these areas are tribal areas. And I have to say that this is one of the areas we are really working on, is to build partnerships with the tribal communities in our area. But up until now, we haven't been able to really figure out how to work together and engage them in our count. So we work together in other ways to measure and look at the number of homelessness, look at the numbers of homelessness in their community, but we have not been able to engage them in the count. So we're not actually allowed to be able to count in some of those areas. And the areas that are green are national parks, and most of the areas in between our metro area is all desert, like you saw, with cactus and definitely the desert that you might see on TV or you think of as real desert area. So because of the uniqueness of our county, we had to develop a mixed method approach. Most of our resources, like I said earlier, are centered in Tucson's metro area. And we do a census count in that area, which is what probably most of you are familiar with, deploying people all over the this metro area to do a census count. So we know that this strategy will miss some folks in the outlying areas because they're a little bit more hidden, maybe living in camps in the desert or in different areas that are sort of off the beaten path. We also knew that this strategy was not going to reach all of the youth in our community. So in the outlying areas and with youth, we partner with social service agencies to host events. And that's sort of a name that sounds bigger than what it is, but it might just be if in a local area or a community-based agency has a day where they hand out food. We coordinate with them to conduct surveys with people who might be coming to receive food boxes. And with youth, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, we tried a different approach with our event last year. So, and then in countywide, we use sampling techniques to count people who might be in these areas. And keep in mind, much of our county is really inaccessible by car, so that has proven to be a little bit challenging as well. So with our census count, we deploy about 30 teams of 4 to 10 people across Metro Tucson, and we work to cover the entirety of the designated assigned sector and make it mandatory that people are in at least groups of 2 within their teams, and engage all people who appear to have slept in a place that's not meant for habitation the night before and ask them to complete a survey. And so this is the count that I'm sure most people are used to conducting and familiar with. So this is a map of the area included in our census count. Uh-oh. And when we prepare to do our count, we break it up into sectors that look like this. So each team is deployed into a certain sector of the community, and they're different sizes because we use our information from our outreach workers to determine where we're likely to find the most people who are experiencing homelessness. So some areas are bigger because we're less likely to encounter people there, and some areas are smaller. And we aim to put the people who have the most experience in the areas where we know that we will find the majority of people. And as a side note, we also partner with our county GIS department to help develop all of the maps that we need. So we really do have great maps. Each of the point-in-time count teams get maps of their area that are perfect and in color, and it's really nice for them to be able to use that while they're out collecting data in the morning. So like I said earlier, we knew that the census count would miss some people. So in our outlying communities, we work with the local service agencies to have an event or plan around something that's already happening. So an example of an event might be a small resource fair, or like I said, something that is like a point where people are giving out food boxes. And for youth, we asked our community outreach workers to work this event and lead this event to hold a mini youth resource fair. And youth who are on the street are encouraged to complete a survey. And for youth, we do it at a different time of day. We also have resources available or have people there who they're able to connect with, case manager. And we collect surveys from youth experiencing different types of housing instability. We know that later we'll have to separate those out because many of those won't count for our point-in-time count, but it's great information for us as a community to know what the circumstances are of our youth. And really our youth count is a work in progress, and while I have some ideas about how we've done it and we're making changes, like Brian said, we've been learning from our mistakes and things that haven't gone well, but I would love to hear any suggestions from other people about ways that they've been able to connect with youth, especially in this year. That seems really important. So sampling. For our sampling, we utilized a PIMA County map with equally sized sectors, and we eliminated areas that we already knew were national parks, were inaccessible by car, or were tribal lands. And we randomly selected 25% of areas to visit and conduct a count. And then we were able to apply the results of those areas to other desert areas. And that's really one of the challenges, is that there's so many areas that we didn't eliminate initially because we did not know that they're inaccessible by car. So we actually are sending a team of volunteers out to these areas to determine whether or not they're areas that might have some people who are experiencing homelessness. And if it's not possible for people to live there, then we're able to eliminate that during the next count. And this is a map of our county broken into sectors, and as you can see, we can select different areas of our county. The white areas are typically the areas that are sampled. We have another map with that, but I, for some reason, wasn't able to upload that into our PowerPoint that shows exactly the areas that we use to apply our sampling techniques. So our street count overview. Like Brian, we get started early, and I think our first step in our planning process is the review of last year and thinking about what went well, what we could have done differently, knowing that this process is not static. You don't just decide you know, one time that this is how we do it and it continues. No, it continues to grow over time, and each year we really believe that we can do a better job and engage more people. So we start with reviewing last year. We form work groups and teams, connect with our community, work to plan for each sector, because within each sector we have there are certain elements of our team that we would like. So experienced outreach workers, if we know that there's a couple of camps in a particular desert area where there's a lot of veterans, we may want somebody who has some experience in working with veterans. We train the team leaders and volunteers in a couple of different ways. We conduct our count, and then we go into the data side, deduplicate the data and data entry, data analysis, data reporting back to HUD, and then we create a final report for our community. So within the planning and organization, this structure was developed last year. Was the first time we really utilized this structure, and had a small leadership team which consisted of the HMIS lead agency, the collaborative applicant, HMIS committee chairperson, and a point-in-time count leader. And this particular group is, you know, obviously in each community, these are people who have a lot of knowledge of what the expectation is and how to do things accurately. So we use that team to make sure we're following all of the rules and meeting all of the requirements. Our point-in-time count work group is a larger group. It has representatives from community-based agencies, faith-based agencies, people who are currently or formerly experiencing homelessness, and university partners. And this group are people who have a lot of knowledge community-wide. So they know where we'll find people. They'll know what the needs are. They're people who participated in COUNT for many years. So they really bring a lot of experience and knowledge to the leadership. And from that work group, we form teams. And each of these people participate in teams. We have a training team, outlying areas team, incentive team, volunteer coordination team, youth team, and this year, which we didn't have last year, was a team leader lead. So a person who can coordinate all of the team leaders and provide them information and feedback that they may need. Connecting with the community. So we're tapping into networks of many different providers. So we're not only reaching out to people who provide services to people who are experiencing homelessness, but we want to tap into networks that are different and involve, and it really proves to be a way that the community providers can work together and share information about their services, so it really is quite a collaborative group. It is within this group that we're creating excitement around the count. We came up with a theme. Last year was Everyone Counts. This year our theme is Working Together Counts. We involve currently and formerly homeless people, and we are use a user-friendly volunteer sign-up sheet. So we also have many different roles for volunteers. So not everyone who volunteers has to be a person who can go out and participate in the count. Often we have people who may have more limited mobility who volunteer to do some of our administrative work, like sign in for the training, help organize the teams. So we try to make a role for people who want to participate, even if it's not a participating in the count out in the field. And we also issue press releases through social media and print media, and to encourage people to participate. And we actually have a lot of news agencies who spend some time focusing on our count as well. Last year was the first time. In past years, we have offered one large community training for all of the volunteers, and then a couple of smaller trainings for the team leaders. And this year, or last year, was our first time offering online trainings, because one of the things, as I said earlier, our county and community is so big that it's a deterrent for people who live in the outlying areas if it's going to take them, you know, over an hour, a couple hours to get to a training, we didn't want that to be a deterrent for participation, but we also didn't feel comfortable not providing any training at all for people. So we created an online training that we were able to share with different communities, different outlying areas, and asked that the team leader facilitate the training of those volunteers. We also conduct separate team leader and community volunteer training. So questions that the team leaders might have, they're probably a little bit more informed and not brand new to the point-in-time count. So listening to their suggestions and their letting people share ideas and network with each other with great ways to address their particular sectors. And trainings are also an opportune time to rally the community and thank volunteers. So there's not too many times throughout this process that all of the volunteers are together. So it's a great time to really thank the community and make sure people know that we appreciate their time they're donating to the efforts that matter to all of us. So the day of the count, the team leaders meet their team at a predetermined location, and much of this is determined during the whole group training. So that's when team leaders meet their team of volunteers. So they'll determine where they want to meet their team in the morning. Generally around 6 in the morning. Sometimes people will go a little bit later. The teams go out and interview people who are experiencing homelessness in their sector. Our people who are interviewed are given gift cards or clothing items for their time. And then the surveys and additional materials are returned to headquarters. We have not used an app, so I was really excited to hear about that actually, Brian. We talked about it a couple of years ago when there was the app from HUD that was being piloted, and are really interested in learning more about that because I agree, I think that would be fantastic. But as of yet, we have not employed that technique. So we have a headquarters where all of the surveys and additional materials are returned. What happens after the count? We created this slide because the day after the count, people are really excited to hear about, especially those who have volunteered, what were the numbers, what did we collect, they want to know. And it's important that we do share that with our community. But I created this slide, not for this particular presentation, but for one to share that once the count happens, much of the work is just beginning. So the surveys are collected and organized. Data is reviewed and deduplicated. Volunteers enter data into databases. The data is de-identified from the sheltered count and is submitted to us, University of Arizona Zero, to analyze and to analyze the data. And then it goes back to the HMIS lead agency and compiled with the shelter count data and then submitted to the HMIS committee who approves the data. The COC executive board approves the data, and then the data is submitted to HUD. So there's quite a lot that happens after the count. But really important after that is the post-count wrap-up. So being able to debrief the street count, and that happening soon after the count is really important because we just forget. So one of the things that I knew from last year's count is at headquarters we really need to have a stapler. We did not have one for whatever reason. So it might seem like a little thing, but it's nice to be able to remember that if that's something that that hadn't made an impact this last year. So what went well and what could be improved? We hold a community event to share the data and thank volunteers. So when the data is all ready, and last year this happened in May, we had a community event with the mayor and some other leaders in our community to talk about the data that we collected and also to talk about some of the information that wasn't specific to the point-in-time count, but also anecdotal information and about homelessness in our community and information that we know that we're not collecting through the count. And that's where we consider all sources of data to determine community priorities. And then from there we begin to plan the 2018 street count in this case, so for the next year. And one of the ways to do that is to look at what communities that are similar are doing in their count, and are there ideas that might work in our own communities. or are there just sort of a sharing, are there things that we haven't even thought of that we might want to consider? So that's a brief overview of our count in TUCSON and PIMA County. And I think Jordan will probably take over and have a chance for questions.
Thank you. So we have time for a few questions, and a few have come in. First, Brian, if you're still there, you've piqued people's interests by this app thing, and a few questions have come in about that. So you had SimTech. You mentioned SimTech, which is SIMTECH. I believe if people are interested in that. SimTech developed this for you, or so a few questions. Was that developed for you? Is it something that's available to other people? Is it something you paid for, or is it that HUD one that HUD came out with?
So, okay, yeah. So it was not solely for Connecticut, but it is something we pay for on the back end. That is not just using the app, but it's also having a command center. So I mentioned that in my presentation, where you kind of sit back and you can see the little bubbles popping up where the surveys are going in, and you can see like the content of the surveys too. So if something comes in and it just kind of looks wonky, or if it's missing a piece of information somewhere, you're able to immediately identify that and get right in touch with the person that's going on. You can watch all that happen in real time. But there is a cost associated with it, specifically around using the full functionality of everything. But it was not just designed for Connecticut. It's designed for use in any continuum or whatever kind of geography it is you conduct your point-in-time counts in.
Yeah, thanks. So as far as one of the questions is whether this is required to use an app nationwide, it's not. HUD's addressed that in some recent presentations, and HUD did develop an app a year or two ago. It's not my understanding that it's being continued in its support like into the future, but communities are encouraged to work with places like SimTech to develop their own and use an app if it's effective.
Right. So while HUD's not requiring it, we are in Connecticut for all the reasons I outlined earlier. It makes life so much easier.
Awesome. Thanks. So I think that addresses that one. For those interested, just give a Google search to SIMTECH, SimTech for their page there. All right. So here's a question for either of you. When you're deciding how many volunteers to put into place and how long to have them in that geography, how do you decide how long they should count that area and how many people to put there? I'm kind of combining two questions. The point is, how do you determine that you've fully counted people in an area that you are assuming got a full count, and especially where that count might then be extrapolated to other areas? How do you have people count multiple times and throughout the same area? Do you overstock volunteers? How do you get an assurance that you've covered an entire sampled or census area? Any thoughts on that, Brian or Claudia?
So in Connecticut, it's going to, again, depend on our region, because Claudia put up the pictures of the desert and then the densely packed cities. I could have just as easily put up a picture of some cows in some densely packed cities, because the geography of Connecticut is pretty diverse as well. So in the more dense regions, it's a blitz count of what's going on, so everybody goes out right at the same time. So everything gets covered within a certain time frame. So we make sure that everything gets hit right around the same time, and we get enough information to make sure that if Brian got counted in block 1, 2, 3, if I happen to move to 4, 5, 6 before the volunteers got there, we make sure that Brian doesn't get counted twice. And that starts with the question, have you already taken a survey tonight? And understanding that someone might have already identified that they're going to get a toiletry bag or something like that. If they answer no to that question, we get enough information after that to make sure that the information can be deduplicated after that. But we, again, have that as a regional decision, which is vastly different depending on where you end up in Connecticut. And we try to get everybody out at the same time and not draw it out over like a 12-hour period, but instead have a 7 to 11 period where folks are out and counting.
And I think that's a great question, and that is absolutely something that we have toyed with in TUCSON also. So like Brian, we do our count early in the morning, but we do have all of the volunteers out at the same time, so or within a window. As far as the number of volunteers per sector, we work really closely with our community outreach workers. So they typically have a fairly good idea of where we're going to find a lot of people, and that does change from year to year. So in those areas where we know that we're likely to come across a lot of people, we put more people, obviously. But then we also, that's a little bit of what the kind of, we call it headquarters does, is if, and we actually had this situation last year where in one particular area where we didn't expect to come across a lot of people, we did. And so they were able to call and say, there are a lot of people here and we don't have enough volunteers. So we moved volunteers from another sector that we didn't originally expect to find very many people and asked them to go to that area as well. So I think we try to stay flexible, but also the teams have really good knowledge of exactly what their boundaries are, and on the maps that we get, they're very detailed with regard to washes, which are like ditches, and alleys. So it has a lot of that information on the map. So we were expecting that teams of 2 within the larger team will go out and really cover all of those areas. One more thing we do is we ask our team leaders to canvass their areas prior to the count so that they have a good idea of what they might encounter on that day and can direct their team to specific areas or focus on certain areas.
Thanks. That's great. Yeah, and the only thing I would add is because I've seen in a lot of COC and several COCs where you add a bunch of questions, you add a bunch of stuff to your survey. Perhaps you're doing assessments, vulnerability assessments, or things like that on top. You got to be really careful in thinking about how long are these surveys going to take, because what you don't want to do is send a bunch of volunteers into an area and then they can't cover that whole area. So you could test run your surveys, estimate the number of people you're going to need in an area based on prior years, and perhaps put a few extra people to ensure that areas you're census counting or that are going to be the basis of extrapolating to other sampled to other non-sampled areas that those are really accurate. So let me switch gears a little bit. Actually, it's sort of similar. Claudia, you mentioned random census or random sampling of rural areas and extrapolating to the rest. Brian, we have a question. Is that how you approach your rural areas as well, a sampling of those and extrapolation to the rest?
So yes, what we do is we work with our regions, because they're the ones that know the regions best, to make sure that we specifically identify the regions where they have a high probability of finding someone, and then the sampled regions are generated by some SAS software that will just distribute them not evenly, they'll distribute them around the COC. So when we go to do the extrapolation, it's going to depend on the probability of the area as to what that means for the final number when it gets extrapolated.
Great, thanks. So one question here, and I'm going to put this to both of you and see if you have any thoughts of this, is so when you're finding people in tents or in cars, and you don't quite know how many people are in there, how do you approach that in your community? Do you have an extrapolation number for how many people you estimate that to be, and where do you kind of base that number on? Do you have any thoughts on that and what you found to be helpful in your community?
Well, this is Claudia. We wouldn't necessarily extrapolate numbers from tents or cars. If we come across, and tents are more likely what we encounter in Tucson. If we come across a tent, we may ask, if we are talking to somebody who's there, we may ask a person how many people are inside the tent if everybody's not coming out. But we absolutely try to engage all of the people that we come across and don't apply necessarily those numbers to a different setting.
Yeah, same thing in Connecticut. If we find an encampment that there are 4 tents with no people, that doesn't play into any of the extrapolation factors because there's a good chance that they are in one of our emergency shelters on the night of the count, and we don't weigh anything any differently if there are any empty areas where we historically have found people.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I might add that this will really probably depend on which community you're in. If you're in somewhere like San Francisco where a high proportion are individuals versus in New York City where a much higher proportion are families, then your basis would be completely different. So it would have to be quite COC specific, I suppose. We only have time for 1 or 2 other quick questions. Do you, in your rural areas particularly, do you have people, have you ever tried having people canvass using cars? And similarly, let me just throw this in at the same time, do you have police go and help you canvass areas? Brian, how about you? Do you have any thoughts on either of those?
Sorry, I was just talking to the muted phone. Yeah, it also depends on all the regions, but yes, the police are involved in a number of our different regions that help volunteers go out because they are many times the best source of information as to where we're going to find people. They are regularly involved and often do help canvass in a lot of our regions.
And
Thanks.
we
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say we absolutely use cars. And I really do have to sort of make the distinction for us between rural areas and desert areas, because in rural areas, which we absolutely have, it's areas where people typically live. In some of our desert areas, it's large stretches of land with no people or resources. So we have to use cars. We use cars in our metro area. Tucson is a really spread out city, and so we use cars. Drive around in all of our areas, and we have not. We do not have law enforcement participate in the count. At least as there may be law enforcement officers who participate, but not as a group.
Thanks. Yeah, I did see, we had Fort Lauderdale, Broward County, Florida in a previous webinar, and they did have police involved in teams to go out and count. You might, the person who asked that question, you might take a look at their online resources and maybe find something about that. I think we're about out of time. Let me add here the comments from somebody saying regarding the apps that data field is affordable and is used as an alternative to Simtech, is used in Miami-Dade County, Florida. So that's data field.
I didn't mean for this to turn into a I didn't mean for this to turn into a commercial for the vendor that I use. So by all means, if someone has another one out there, go for it.
Yeah. So all right. Well, I think that gets us to about out of time. Keep an eye out for the webinar to be posted online within a week. Thank you so much to our presenters, Claudia and Brian. Super appreciated to have you here, and to everyone else. Hope you have a great day. Thanks.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you. Bye.